Take me. Leave the boy. One sentence. And the man who would become her husband, standing at the edge of a crowd in a dusty Arizona square, heard it and walked straight into the worst kind of trouble a quiet man could find. Her name was Tehya. Spring of 1883, the outpost of Calabasas Crossing, southern Arizona territory. She was Apache, barely 22, and she stood on a wooden platform in the morning sun with her nephew Nayland pressed tight against her left side, his thin shoulder under her palm. A stranger named Silas paid for both of them that morning, paid with money he probably couldn't spare, and walked them home. Neither of them knew yet what that walk would become. Neither of them knew that the silence between two strangers can grow into something neither one planned or asked for, something stubborn and total, the kind that becomes a life. Watch until the end, because what began in that square changed both of them in ways that neither could undo. If their story moves you, like and subscribe. New stories every week. Now, back to the beginning. The square at Calabasas Crossing smelled of horse dung and fresh-cut pine lumber and something sharp underneath. The metallic bite of anxiety that a crowd of people produces when they know what they are watching is wrong and have decided collectively not to say so. It was a Tuesday in late April. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed had come out in pale yellow-green leaf, and the light fell through them in long, broken columns, and under any other circumstance it might have been a beautiful morning. Tehya had not slept in 3 days. They had been taken from her sister's camp 12 miles east, in a dry canyon that curved like a bent elbow through the red rock hills. 7 men on horseback, carrying papers from a territorial judge whose name Tehya did not recognize, with a seal she had no way to verify. Her sister had fought, screaming in Apache and then in her broken English that the boy was hers, that no paper had authority over her child. One of the men had struck her across the mouth with an open hand, and that was the last Tehya had seen of her. She did not know if her sister still lived. She had been keeping that particular fear behind a wall inside herself for 3 days, feeding it nothing, refusing to look at it directly, because if she opened that door, she would be unable to function, and she needed to function. Nayland needed her to function. He was 7 years old and small for it. He had his mother's round face and a serious way of watching things that was older than his years. He had not cried once during the march. Tehya had watched him resist it with everything he had, pressing his mouth into a thin line, breathing through his nose, the way she had shown him the previous summer, when the younger boys had been unkind about his size. She had taken him aside then and told him plainly that tears were not weakness, that a warrior could weep and still be a warrior. He had listened with the careful attention he brought to everything and then done what 7-year-old boys do, which was file the lesson away for later and go back to being 7. On the platform in Calabasas, he was not 7. He was something older and more frightened than he had words for, and he stood close enough to her that she could feel his breath against her arm. The man running the transaction was named Pruett. Tehya had learned this from listening. He wore a brown hat with a sweat-darkened band, and he had the kind of voice that was always slightly louder than necessary, the voice of a man who has spent years making sure rooms knew he was in them. He was explaining, to 2 other men who had come to look, that what he had was a working pair, that the woman was strong and the boy was young enough to train. He used words that landed on Tehya's skin like gravel. She kept her eyes on the far side of the square. This was a discipline she had cultivated during the march. If she looked at the men doing the looking, she would want to speak, and anger in her voice would give them an excuse to take it out on Nayland. So she watched the far wall of the livery stable, where a woodpecker was working at a dead section of pine with mechanical patience. She was still watching the woodpecker when Pruett began his negotiation with the two buyers, and she understood from the rhythm of the exchange, from the pauses and the counting sounds, that they were going to take only one of them. She looked at Nayland. He looked back at her. His eyes were very dark and very steady, and she understood from the set of his mouth that he already knew, that he had been listening with that quiet attention that was so particularly his, and that he was preparing himself to be the one left behind. That was when she stepped forward. "Take me." In English, clear and flat. "Leave the boy." The crowd shifted, not much. The way a crowd shifts when it hears something it didn't expect and hasn't yet decided what to do with. Pruett turned and looked at her with an expression that was more annoyed than anything else. The look of a man whose transaction has been interrupted by an item in the transaction. "Nobody asked you." She held his gaze. She had her mother's capacity for stillness, that particular Apache quality of being so settled in the body that the earth itself seems to back you up. "I know cattle, I know horses, I know how to cook on a fire in the open. He is a child. Take me. Leave the boy with whatever priest or mission you have in this town. He won't survive what you're selling him into." Pruett opened his mouth. From the far side of the crowd, a voice cut across the square. "How much?" It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence that has already made a decision and is only asking for the arithmetic. The man who had spoken was standing at the edge of the gathered people, and the gathered people turned to look at him the way a crowd turns toward any disturbance that might become interesting. He was lean and dark-haired, somewhere in his early 30s, with a face that had not yet been lined by the kind of hard living that ruins men early, though there was something in his jaw and the set of his eyes that said he was not entirely a stranger to difficulty either. He wore a plain gray shirt and a battered hat he had pushed back on his head. His hands were at his sides, not on his gun. He looked less like a man starting trouble than a man finishing an errand. His name was Silas Vane, and later, when Tehya tried to reconstruct the moment, she could never quite explain what she had thought when she first saw him. Not rescue, certainly. She had learned too early and too specifically not to expect rescue from white men in territory towns. But something else. Something in the plain directness of those two words that was different in quality from everything else she had heard in 3 days. Pruett looked him over. "You buying?" "I'm asking what it costs, both of them." Pruett laughed. One of the two buyers made a sound that was not a laugh. The people in the crowd exchanged small glances, the private language of witnesses who are deciding whether to be entertained or alarmed. "Both of them," Pruett repeated. "You heard me." The negotiation that followed was not long. Silas did not haggle the way a man haggles over horses or grain. He put a number on the table, Pruett countered, and Silas put the same number on the table again, with a different quality in his voice, and something in that repetition seemed to communicate something that made Pruett decide the number was satisfactory. Money changed hands. The kind of exchange that should not have been possible, that the law, written and real, prohibited, but which happened anyway in the gaps between where law was written and where law actually lived. Silas walked to the platform. He looked at Tehya and then at Nayland. He did not smile and he did not offer his hand. His voice, when he finally used it, was the flattest she had heard from a man who was attempting something difficult. "You got anything you need to get from wherever they're keeping your things?" Tehya looked at him for a long moment. "No." "All right." That was the whole of their first conversation. He walked toward a bay horse hitched at the rail, and they followed him because the alternative was standing on a platform in Calabasas Crossing with Pruett, and whatever came next was not likely to be worse than that. He had a single horse. He lifted Nayland up first, without asking, then Tehya, and then he took the reins himself and walked, leading them out of the square and down the main street and onto the western road that ran between two stands of saguaro toward the dry hills. He walked the whole way rather than ride, which meant he was watching the road and not watching them. And after a while, the crowd noise from the town square fell behind, and there was only the sound of the horses' feet on packed dirt and the wind moving through the cactus spines. Nayland rode with his hands on the saddle horn and looked at the back of the man's hat and said nothing. Tehya sat behind Nayland, with her hands light on his small shoulders, and felt the town release her like a fist unclenching, and breathed slowly and tried to understand what had just happened. She did not know this man. She did not know his ranch or his territory or his intentions. She had spent the last 3 days in the hands of men whose intentions she had been able to read perfectly, and that legibility had been its own kind of horror. This was something else. She could not read Silas Vane. His back was a wall. His silence was a wall. He walked with a purposeful, ordinary stride, like a man coming home from picking up his nails and flour, and she thought, either he is the most dangerous kind of man there is, or he is exactly what he looks like. She decided to wait and see which one was true. The ranch was 7 miles from town, set at the base of a shallow rise where a line of cottonwoods marked a seasonal creek. It was not large. A main house built from adobe and rough timber, a barn and corral in better repair than the house, a chicken yard fenced in wire, and beyond the back fence a long slope of grassland that ran up to a ridgeline of dark rock. A working place maintained by one pair of hands, and showing it. Nothing frivolous, nothing decorative. The kind of property that has no time for the extra step. He put the horse in the corral and pointed out the pump and the outhouse without ceremony, and then he went inside to make something to eat. Tehya stood in the yard with Nayland for a moment, both of them looking at the mountains, and Nayland took her hand with both of his, the way he had not done since he was much younger, and she squeezed his fingers once and let him hold on. Dinner was beans and hard bread and dried venison heated in a pan. He set the table for 3, which was a choice she noticed. He sat down and they sat across from him, and he offered no grace or gratitude or any of the usual scaffolding men built around meals in her experience, and they ate in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. It was simply quiet. Nayland ate fast, the hunger of 3 lean days, and Tehya made sure he had the second portion before she took her own. Silas refilled Nayland's tin cup with water without any fuss when he noticed it was empty. That was all. But Tehya watched him do it and filed it away in the same careful mental catalogue where she was building everything else she knew about him. After, when she had washed the dishes at the pump and brought the boy inside and laid him down on the bedroll Silas had set out near the fireplace, she stood in the doorway of the main room and held her ground until he looked up from his reading. "Why did you buy us?" It was not quite a question. "What do you want from this?" He folded whatever he was reading and considered the ceiling for a moment, as if the answer required some sorting. "I don't want anything from it. I couldn't watch what was happening and drive away." Men watch things like that every day and drive away. "I know it." He looked back at the table. "It wasn't a noble calculation. I just couldn't make myself do the other thing." She studied him a moment longer. He had the look of a man who was telling a plain truth and finding it slightly embarrassing, and she had come to believe over years that embarrassment in that particular register was harder to fake than most things. "We'll work for what we cost you." "You don't have to." "We will." It was not a negotiation. He seemed to understand this. He nodded, the short nod of a man who has registered the final word on a subject, and turned back to his book. She went to the bedroll beside Nayland's and lay down without removing her boots and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the horse moving in the corral, the creak of the house in a gust, a coyote somewhere distant, and did not sleep for a long time. But that was all right. She had learned in the last 3 days that she could function without sleep, and there were still things to figure out. The first week was careful and triangular. Silas did the morning feeding and the fence work and the deep chores, and Tehya moved through the house and the kitchen with the particular efficiency of a woman who had managed a camp and knew how to make a small resource go a long distance. And Nayland followed her like a shadow, until he decided he was more interested in what Silas was doing with the fence posts. Silas let him hold the post steady while he drove the staples, and by the third day the boy was handing him tools without prompting, and leaning in with questions in a low voice. "What is this thing called? Why do you do it that way?" Tehya watched this from the kitchen window. She was not sure what to think about it. She knew English well. Her father had traded with Anglo settlements for 15 years and had believed, in a pragmatic way, that the language was going to be important. Silas had no Apache, which was not surprising. She did not offer to teach him, and he did not press. But she noticed that he listened, really listened, when she spoke, which was not as common a quality in men as it ought to have been. He gave them the bedroom without discussion. He took the main room. She had protested this once, briefly, and he had looked at her with a brief, somewhat exasperated expression that she came to recognize as his version of a closed argument. His bedroll was fine. He was used to it, and that was the end of that. 3 days after they arrived, she found his brother's tobacco tin on the shelf above the fireplace. It was old and dented, and she picked it up and shook it, and nothing moved inside it, just the faint rattle of emptiness. She put it back carefully, exactly where it had been. But that evening when he sat by the fire, and his eyes moved toward that shelf and stopped, she understood something she hadn't before about the particular quality of the quiet inside this house, and why the barn was in better repair than the walls. In the second week, she planted the kitchen garden she had found neglected behind the house, the soil already turned, but abandoned before anything had gone in. She worked Nayland into it, showing him which end of the seed went down, and how to press the dirt back without compacting, and he worked with focused seriousness beside her. Silas, passing through the yard on some other errand, stopped and looked at what she was doing, and she thought he was going to raise the subject of ownership or permission. Instead, he offered, in his flat, practical way, that there was a book on kitchen gardens in the back room he had never read. She might find something useful in it, or not. "I'll look at it," she told him. He brought it that evening. She read it by the lamp while Nayland slept, found 3 things she hadn't known, and marked them with a stick of charcoal. She left the book where he could see the marks if he was curious. He never mentioned it, but she saw him read those same 3 pages on a Tuesday when he thought she wasn't watching. The town was the harder problem. Calabasas Crossing was not a kind place, and the people in it had mostly decided what they thought about an Apache woman under a cowboy's roof before they had any information to base that decision on. The first time she rode with Silas into town for supplies, 2 weeks after they arrived, She felt the specific quality of attention that a crowd gives to something it has already categorized. She kept her chin level and her eyes moving, and she did not let herself feel it the way she would have if she had been alone. She was not alone. That was different. In the general store, the owner, a man named Cutler with a broad red face, served Silas without comment and looked at Tehya the way you look at weather you have decided you cannot do anything about. One of the women at the end of the counter leaned toward her companion and murmured something, and the companion looked and then looked away. Tehya picked up a bolt of blue cotton on the back shelf and turned it over and examined the edge of the weave with the same attention she would have given anything she was considering buying, and put it back and moved on. On the way out, the marshal intercepted them on the boardwalk. His name was Hatch. He was not an unkind man, she thought, but he was a man who existed inside the rules of his world, the way a river exists inside its banks, and those rules did not have a clear place for what he was looking at. He put his question to Silas directly and politely. What was the situation? Silas told him, briefly. They were working at the ranch, and he was responsible for them. Hatch looked at Tehya, and then at the street beyond her, and then back at Silas, and expressed, in the careful language of a man who hopes to avoid paperwork, that he hoped there wouldn't be trouble. Silas told him he didn't plan on there being any. Hatch nodded and stepped aside. On the ride back, Tehya weighed the calculation plainly. People in this town will make things difficult for you. Silas kept his eyes on the road. People in this town are difficult for a lot of people. That's not new. You could send us somewhere else. There are missions, agencies. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, do you want to go to a mission? She thought of Nalen's face on the platform in the square. She thought of what missions did with children who arrived alone and frightened. No. Then that's settled. They did not talk again for the rest of the road. But she noticed that the silence had changed quality slightly, the way the air changes a degree before rain, and she did not examine that change too closely because she was not sure what she would find if she did. The weeks moved. April became May, and then June, and the desert heat settled in like a guest who has decided to make itself comfortable. The kitchen garden came up, the beans first, then the squash, then a row of chili peppers that made Nalen's eyes go wide with suspicion. She cooked in the Apache way when she could, and in the way she had learned from the border settlements when she could not. And once she made a stew with dried corn and juniper berries that she had found in the hills. Silas ate 2 bowls of it without comment, and then, at the end, offered the plainest possible compliment. It was good. The simplicity of it was more than anything longer would have been. Nalen had begun to trail after Silas in the mornings with something that was becoming, through no decision either of them had made, the specific texture of instruction. Silas showed him how to read a horse's mood from its ears and its breathing. He showed him the right way to coil a rope so it didn't kink. He showed him, one slow afternoon, how to read the clouds in the south for weather, pressing his finger against the sky as if pointing at a word in a book. Nalen listened with his whole body the way he listened to Tehya, and sometimes watching them from across the yard, Tehya felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for, and did not try to name. She had not trusted easily since she was a girl. Trust was a thing she extended carefully and withdrew without drama when the evidence required it. She had been wrong twice. Wrong in her assessment of the men who had come with papers to the canyon. Wrong in her first reading of what she was facing. Both times the wrongness had cost her. She watched Silas with the steady patience she had applied to everything since childhood. She watched him make decisions about the stock, about the land, about money that was always slightly tighter than it needed to be. And the way he made them was always quiet and straight. No performance, no explanation when none was required. She watched him with Nayland and saw, in the way he was careful never to fill the boy's head too fast, that he understood something about the particular fragility of a child who has been yanked from his context. She watched him in the evenings, reading at the table, and saw that he read actual books, not just almanacs, which revealed something about the shape of his interior life. She was not falling in love with him. She was being honest with herself about that. But she was falling into something, a consideration of him, a willingness to admit that he was worth the effort of knowing. And in her experience, that was the harder thing to undo than whatever came after. It was Nayland who named it first, in the direct way of children. They were in the kitchen on a Saturday morning when Silas had gone to check the eastern fence, and Nayland was helping her sort the beans from the garden, and he said, without looking up from the beans, "He's a good man." Tehya kept sorting. "He seems to be. Better than most," the authority of a 7-year-old who has been paying close attention to men for several months. She looked at him. He was very serious about the beans. "Yes," she agreed, "better than most." Nayland nodded as if a conclusion had been reached and went back to sorting. The trouble came in late June, in the form of 2 men on horseback who appeared at the gate in the early morning when the light was still orange and the shadows still long. Tehya was at the pump when she saw them, and she recognized them before they were through the gate, the posture, the quality of attention, the kind of men Pruett had sent with papers to the canyon. She set down the bucket and walked back to the house without hurrying. Silas was at the table with his coffee. One look at her face and he was on his feet, moving to the window to look for himself. He turned with his hat in his hand. "Get Nayland inside. Don't come out until I say." "Silas, please." He did not use that word much, and the plainness of it settled something in her. She got Nayland from the back room and sat him at the kitchen table with the task of shelling the remaining peas, which was enough of an occupation to keep him in place, and she went to the window where she could see the yard. The 2 men had come through the gate by then. One of them she recognized from the canyon. The other was new to her, larger, with a quality of patience about him that she found more frightening than the first man's bluster. Silas stood between them and the house with his thumbs in his belt loops and no particular expression on his face. She could not hear all of what passed between them. She caught the shape of it, something about the transaction in Calabasas being irregular, something about Pruett having a claim, something about it being better for everyone if there were no unpleasantness. The larger man made a gesture toward the house that was not quite a threat, and not quite not one either. Silas answered short and flat. Both men looked at him. The larger man pressed. Silas gave him the same answer again, or something very close to it, with a different quality in the silence around it. He did not move his hands toward his gun. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood where he was, and repeated himself with the quality of a man who has decided how far the river runs, and is waiting for the other party to figure that out. The 2 men looked at each other. There was a calculation being done, the quick arithmetic of trouble, and after a moment the larger man seemed to decide that the arithmetic did not favor him this morning, in this yard, with this particular audience. He touched his hat, not to Silas exactly, but in the general direction of the conclusion, and turned his horse, and the other man followed him, and they went out through the gate and down the road. Tehya let out a breath she had been holding. Silas stood in the yard until the dust settled, and then turned and came back to the house. He did not look alarmed, and he did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who has finished one errand and is already thinking about the next. He poured himself more coffee. She was at the table by then. He sat down across from her, and the first thing he put on the table between them was plain. "They'll be back. I know it. If you want to go somewhere else." "I don't." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Whatever passed between them in that moment was not anything that needed words, and they both understood this. "All right," she said. "You could have been hurt." "I wasn't." "You could have been." He turned the coffee cup in his hands, looking at the surface of it. "Yeah, that's true." It was not an answer exactly, but it told her the thing she wanted to know, which was that he understood the weight of what he had done and had done it anyway, and that this was not bravado or a performance but something quieter and more deliberate, a choice made in full knowledge of its cost. She thought about her sister. She thought about Nayland, shelling peas in the kitchen with his small, serious hands. She thought about the platform in Calabasas and the particular quality of helplessness she had felt there, and how different this felt, even now, with trouble still on the road and likely to return. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. She had the sense it was not something he had expected, and that he did not know exactly where to put it. He nodded once, then pushed back from the table and said he had to go check on the livestock, and went out. Nayland appeared at the kitchen doorway with the bowl of peas. "Are they gone?" "For now." He set the bowl down and came and stood beside her and looked at the yard where Silas had been standing. He wasn't scared. It was not quite admiration and not quite a question. "He was scared," Tehya answered. "He was scared, and he did it anyway. That's the whole thing, Nayland." The boy thought about this with the gravity he brought to everything. "Like you on the platform." Her throat tightened. She smoothed the hair back from his forehead, the thick, straight black of it, so much like his mother's. "Like me on the platform." Pruett's men came back at the end of August, and this time they were not 2 but 4, and they came not in the morning, but in the late afternoon when the light was horizontal, and the shadows were confused, and a man could misjudge distance. Tehya heard the horses first, and went to the window, and understood in a moment what was different about this visit. The number of them, the formation, the way they spread slightly as they came through the gate. Silas was in the corral. He saw them, and came through the fence, and picked up the rifle he had left against the post, and walked to meet them. There was a moment, watching from the window, when Tehya weighed what she was doing. She was a woman who had been instructed, explicitly and implicitly and repeatedly over her whole life, to stay inside, to stay back, to let the men do what men do. She had agreed to this when it made sense, and defied it when it didn't, and the calculus of the moment was clear. She went to the back of the house where the older shotgun was kept on its pegs. She checked that it was loaded. She went out the back door and around the side of the house and came up along the wall to where she could be seen by the men in the yard if they chose to look. They chose to look. She stood at the corner of the house with the shotgun in both hands, not raised, just held, and she looked at Pruett's men the same way she had looked at Pruett himself on the platform in April. Level, flat, without performance. One of the men said something she couldn't hear. The leader of the 4, a new man with a long beard and a quality of professional calculation about him, looked at her and then looked at Silas, and then back at her. An exchange passed between the two men, brief, professional, the language of the cost-benefit calculation. The addition of her presence had changed the arithmetic. 4 against 2 was different from 4 against 1. Not impossible, but different. The bearded man made a decision. She could see it happen in the set of his shoulders, something that was going to become the end of this particular visit. A word to his men. They turned. They went out through the gate. Silas waited until they were 100 yards down the road before he lowered the rifle. He turned and looked at her. His expression was a complicated thing. Something relieved and something exasperated, and underneath both of those, something that she had not seen before and was not ready to name. "I told you to stay inside." "I know what you told me." She walked toward him across the yard. It was 4 of them. "I could have managed." "You could have managed 2 of them," she said, which was perhaps the most direct thing she had put between them in 4 months, and he looked at her, and then he did something she had not seen him do before, which was laugh. Not a long laugh. A short one, more breath than sound. But it was genuine, and the genuineness of it undid something in the careful distance she had been keeping. She looked at the road where the men had gone. "They'll come back again with more. Or they'll decide we're too much trouble and find easier work." He turned the rifle over in his hands, an unconscious inspection. "Pruett's a businessman. What he sells has to be worth the cost of recovering it." "He might decide it is." "He might." A long look at the gate. "Then we'll handle that when we get there." She stood beside him in the late afternoon light and felt the particular quality of the day, the heat beginning to lean off, the smell of the horse and the dry grass, and the distant suggestion of rain somewhere in the mountains, the presence of this man beside her like a wall that had decided to stand in a specific direction. She had been building a catalogue of him for 4 months. She knew his silences and what they meant. She knew the way he moved when something was wrong, and the way he moved when something was right, and the difference between them. She knew that he ate the same breakfast every morning without complaint, and that he had a habit of looking at the sky before he started any outdoor work, and that when he was troubled he did not talk, but he read, sitting at the table with one hand flat on the page, as if the words needed grounding. She knew that when Nayland laughed at something, the boy's face went open and young in a way that was increasingly rare, and that Silas registered this every time with a small internal satisfaction he never expressed. She knew, because she had made herself know, that he was a good man in the way that was harder than the obvious ways, the way that was just daily and ordinary and chosen, morning after morning, without announcement. She was not falling in love with him. She had been lying to herself about that for 3 months. Summer moved into the long amber slowdown of early fall. The garden was in its last yield, squash heavy on the vine, the chili peppers reddening in the heat. Nayland had started going with Silas on his morning rounds, walking along the fence line with the natural ease of a boy who had decided this was his particular territory to know. He pressed questions into every gap of the work-day, and Silas answered them straight, without simplifying, in the way that meant he thought the boy was worth a real answer. One evening in September, Tehya was carrying water from the pump to the kitchen, and she came around the corner of the house and found them sitting on the back step, Nayland and Silas side by side, shoulder to shoulder, the boy's head slightly inclined toward the man's arm, both of them watching a hawk that was circling in the last light over the ridge. Neither of them was speaking. Neither of them seemed to feel the need to. The hawk banked and caught the light and turned and was gone, and Nayland made a soft sound of satisfaction, and Silas murmured something she couldn't hear, and the boy laughed. She stood still for a moment, the bucket heavy in her hand, and did not move. She thought about her sister. She thought about the months of not knowing, of sending word through the careful, informal networks that still moved between the Apache bands and the settlements, waiting for something to come back. 3 weeks ago, word had come back. Her sister was alive, relocated to a reservation in the territory east, injured but healing. The child, Nayland, was listed on the papers Pruett had filed as unclaimed. She had written back with the help of a sympathetic clerk in Calabasas, a young woman who was braver than her employment suggested, and the process of what came next was uncertain and slow and full of official patience. But her sister was alive. This was the fact she returned to daily, the way you press a bruise to locate it. In the meantime, Nayland was here, and she was here. And this man, who had bought 2 strangers he didn't know with money he probably couldn't spare, and walked them home without asking for anything, and had been quietly, daily, ordinary about it for 4 months. This man was here too. She walked to the step and set the bucket down, and sat beside Silas on the step, leaving Nayland between them, and looked at the ridge where the hawk had been. Gone. He'll be back. He's nested up there. Uses the thermals off the ridge in the evenings. She looked at the ridge. The light was going now, the orange leaching out of it, the sky above turning a deep clear blue. I need to tell you something. He waited. He was good at waiting. When my sister is recovered enough to travel, she will come for Nayland. I don't know when that will be. She kept her eyes on the ridge. I want you to know that because of what you have done with the boy. I want you to understand what it means. He was quiet for a moment. Nayland had fallen into a drowsy attention on the step between them, the way children do in the evening heat. I understand it. It doesn't change what these months have been, what you've been to him. I want you to know that too. He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was something in the quality of what passed between them in that moment that was as plain and as illegible as weather, something that both of them had been aware of for months, and neither had put into words, because the words would have required a commitment she wasn't sure she could make, and she wasn't sure he was asking for. Whatever happens, he told her, the boy has a home here, for as long as it helps him. She felt her throat tighten in the way that surprised her, the sudden physical fact of something she had been carrying for months. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I know exactly what I'm saying. She looked at the ridge again. The sky was darkening now, the first stars pushing through. Nayland's breathing had gone slow and deep beside her. He calls you by your name. He told me you gave him permission to. I did. Most men would want sir or some other distance. You didn't ask for that. He looked at his hands. I don't need the distance. She thought about what it meant, that sentence, the specific weight of it. A man who does not need the distance. She had been building a life out of necessary distance her whole life, holding herself back from the center of things as a practice of safety, a learned response to a world that was not always safe. And here was a man who had bought them both in a town square, and walked them home and offered a book about gardens, and watched a hawk with a 7-year-old boy, and stood in front of 4 armed men in a yard, and did not need the distance. She did not make a decision. That was the honest way to put it. Something settled in her the way sand settles in still water, slowly and without drama, and she let it settle, and she did not call it anything yet. That night she lay awake for a long time, which was not new, but the quality of the wakefulness was different. She was not afraid. She was not planning. She was simply awake inside a life that had, in the last 4 months, become hers in a way that surprised her, and she was trying to be honest with herself about what that meant. In October, Pruett died. The news came through Calabasas in the particular way that news travels in territory towns, from 3 directions simultaneously, slightly different in detail, entirely consistent in the main fact. A business dispute. A man in Tucson. The papers he had filed in various territories were under review. Whatever machinery had been behind Tehya and Nayland's capture was, if not dismantled, at least disrupted. The 2 men who had come to the yard in August did not return. The morning after the news reached them, Silas made breakfast, which he did most mornings, and set it out, and they sat down together, the 3 of them, and Nayland ate his corn porridge with his customary seriousness, and then looked up with the directness that was so characteristic of him. "Does this mean we're staying?" Tehya and Silas looked at each other across the table. There was a long pause, the kind that carries something inside it. "What would you want?" Tehya asked him. Nayland thought about it. He looked at Silas. He looked at Tehya. He looked at the window, where the cottonwoods along the creek were starting to turn yellow in the October cool. "I want to see my mother, and then I want to come back here." Tehya pressed her lips together. She nodded once. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "We'll make sure you see your mother." He did not say the second part, but Nayland seemed to hear it anyway, because his face went through a series of expressions and settled at something that was as close to peace as a 7-year-old gets. October gave way to November. Word came that Tehya's sister was well enough to receive visitors. Tehya planned the trip, 2 days' ride, then a stage from Calabasas, navigating the territory's complicated official geography. Silas offered to ride with her, and she considered this and agreed, partly because the roads were still uncertain and partly, she admitted to herself, because the offer was not a performance. The morning before they were to leave, she found him in the barn checking the horses' hooves in the early light, and she stood in the doorway and let the silence organize itself before she spoke. "When we come back," she said, "I would like to know if you want this to be permanent. All of it. The 3 of us, on this land, as a family." She paused. "I want to be clear about what I'm asking." He set the horse's hoof down carefully. He turned to look at her. The light in the barn was early and soft, and she could see his face perfectly. "I know what you're asking. Do you want that?" He was quiet for a moment, and she knew him well enough now to know it was not hesitation. It was care. "Yes, I want that." She looked at him for a moment longer, to let herself be certain about what she was reading, and she found that she was certain, and this surprised her, and did not surprise her. "All right. Then that's settled." He looked at her with the complicated expression that had been building in him for months, and hadn't yet found its final form. She turned and walked back toward the house, and she was almost at the door when he called her name. She stopped. "Thank you for asking me straight." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "You were straight with me first, that morning in Calabasas. How much? That was straight enough." He looked like he was about to say something else. Then he nodded and went back to the hooves. She went inside and put Nayland to work packing his things. They left the next morning in the thin November light, the three of them on 2 horses heading east. The cottonwoods along the creek threw their yellow leaves in a slow wind, and the mountains ahead were already wearing their first pale snow high on the ridgeline, and Nayland sat in front of Tehya with a directness of posture that said he was paying attention to everything, storing it, the way he always did. They found her sister on the reservation east, in a small adobe house that smelled of wood smoke and healing herbs, thin and with a scar along her jaw from the blow she had taken in the canyon, and a look in her eyes that had been through the fire and was still standing on the other side of it. She held Nayland for a long time without speaking, her hands pressed against his back, and Nayland held on without his usual restraint, shaking once with something he had been holding back for months. Tehya's sister looked at Silas over the boy's head. Tehya watched them look at each other, the weighing that happened in that look, the assessment, the slow adjustment, and saw her sister make a judgment and set it aside, and then make it again more slowly, and set it aside again, the whole process visible the way things are visible on a face when you know how to read it. Later, when Nayland was asleep and Silas had gone outside to see to the horses, her sister sat across from her in the firelight and put the question plain. "He's a strange one." "He is. Not what I would have expected." "I know." "Is he good to you?" Tehya thought about the question in its full weight. "Yes, he's good to me." Her sister looked at the wall for a moment. "Then be careful with him. The good ones don't last if you don't take care of them." Tehya looked at the fire. "I know how to take care of things." "I know you do." Her sister reached out and put her hand over Tehya's. "I know." They stayed 2 days. On the 3rd morning they rode back, leaving Nayland with his mother. It was what he had wanted and what she had promised him, with the plan that her sister would send word when she was strong enough to travel, and they would arrange the next piece from there. This was complicated and uncertain and dependent on many things going right that had no particular reason to go right, but it was what there was, and Tehya had made a long practice of working with what there was. The ride back was 2 days through country that was high and dry and cold now with the approach of winter, and they rode mostly in companionable silence, which was the kind they had cultivated, the kind that was not the absence of something, but the presence of an understanding. On the 2nd evening, camped beside a creek that still ran low and cold, with a fire built from pinon and the smell of pine smoke in the air, Tehya sat across from Silas and raised what needed to be raised. There was a practical question, papers, if he wanted them, an official acknowledgement of what they were. "I want people to understand what this is, not because I need their understanding, but because it makes some things simpler, and Nayland deserves simple where we can give it to him." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The marshal in Calabasas, Hatch. He's not a bad man." A pause. "He'd witness it, I think, if we went and asked him to." She looked at the fire. She thought about the word, witness. A witness stands at the edge of something and confirms that it happened. There had been no witnesses in the canyon when the men came with papers. There had been witnesses on the platform in Calabasas, and they had looked away. This would be a different kind of witnessing. Yes, I think he would. They arrived back at the ranch on a clear, cold afternoon, the mountains bright with the first real snow, the cottonwoods stripped to their bones along the creek. The ranch looked the same as it always did, solid and spare and particular in the way of working places, and she felt coming through the gate the thing she had been learning to feel since April, which was that this was a place she was inside rather than outside of. She saw on the back post of the corral the board where Nayland had been carving something all fall, in secret. She had not pressed him about it. Now she could see what it was, 3 stick figures, a woman and a man and a small boy between them, scratched in the wood with the particular unself-consciousness of a child's art. Below them, in Nayland's careful block letters, our house. She stood and looked at this for a long moment. Silas had come to stand beside her. He looked at the board. He's been working on that since August. She said nothing. She did not trust her voice quite enough. A moment later he reached into his coat pocket and held something out on his palm. Old gold, worn smooth in the way of things that have been handled and kept and handed down. His grandmother's ring, he explained. He had carried it in the bottom of the trunk for 12 years. He didn't know if she wanted a ring. He was asking. She looked at him. "I'm asking about the ring," he clarified. "Not the other thing. You already answered the other thing." There was something in the way he distinguished between the ring and the thing the ring represented that was so specifically him, so characteristically careful about what was being asked and what had been given, that it reached her in a way that a more elaborate gesture would not have. "I want the ring," he nodded. The practical nod of a man who has established the relevant facts. She took it, and it fit. Not perfectly, but close enough. And she wore it. And the following Saturday they rode to Calabasas together and stood in front of Hatch, the marshal, in his office, which was the least romantic setting in the territory, and made it official. And Hatch witnessed it with the look of a man who has seen stranger things, and is not certain this is one of them, and has decided it doesn't matter. In the spring, her sister was well enough to travel. She came with Nayland and stayed 2 weeks at the ranch, sleeping in the main room, watching the kitchen garden come back up, watching her son trail after Silas through the yard with the ease of a boy who knows his way around a place. She did not comment much on any of it, but on the evening before she left, sitting by the fire while Nayland slept, she looked at Tehya for a long time, and then looked at the rest of the room, the ring on Tehya's finger, and the rifle on its pegs by the door, and the book on kitchen gardens with its charcoal marks, the coffee tin and the tobacco tin, and the 2 boots by the door, and the 3 bedrolls that were always in the same places, and she let the sum of it land on her before she spoke. "You built something here." "We did," Tehya said. "I can see it." Her sister was quiet for a moment. Then, "He'll bring Nayland back in the summers. That's what the boy wants." "That's what we want too." Her sister nodded. Whatever she had been holding on to, the worry, the assessment, the long, careful evaluation, she seemed to let go of it then, settling back against the wall with a softness she had not shown in any of the 2 weeks. Nayland left with his mother in the morning. He hugged Tehya for a long time and then looked at her with his 7-year-old face that was also somehow older than that, and told her he would come back when the heat broke. "I know you will." He turned to Silas and did something he had never done before, which was to reach out and take his hand with both of his, the formal handshake of a boy who has decided something about the status of this person in his life. Silas shook his hand with matching seriousness. "See you when the heat breaks." Nayland nodded, retrieved his hand, and went to his mother, and they walked down the road toward the stage line, and Tehya watched them until they were too small to see clearly, and then a while longer after that. Silas stood beside her at the gate, not touching, just present. "He'll be all right." I know he will." She turned back toward the house. The sun was morning fresh on the cottonwoods, The new leaves, that same pale yellow-green as they had been a year ago when she had arrived on this road with everything against her and nothing certain. The horses were moving in the corral. From the kitchen garden came the quiet sound of things growing. She walked back to the house and to the work that waited there, and Silas walked beside her. And neither of them spoke, because neither of them needed to. And the quiet between them was the good kind, the kind that you build over months of choosing each other, morning after morning, without announcement or fanfare, in the plain, full-bodied, ordinary way that is the only way anything real gets built. That was Tehya's story, a woman who stepped forward in a slave market to save a child, and a man who refused the choice he was given and paid to make his own. Two people from different worlds who built something in the space between them, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but stubbornly and with the full attention of people who have decided that this, right here, is worth the effort. If their story stayed with you, like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and every week a new one. Watch until the end. The end is always worth it.